Hey, welcome back to the channel. Yeah, I guess that's what passes for an introduction around here, so just gonna keep rolling. Hey, how you doing? This video is about the Combine and this year Pro Day numbers. Not about the difference between them, because I just don't care. It's really about why I don't care. About the Combine or the Pro Day, or any of that, really, at all. Talked about it a lot, written about it a few times, but like, we got a YouTube channel now, and it's a new rookie class, and so same things I don't care about are getting talked about a lot. So I thought I owed something of an explanation. You know, why are you so blasé? I mean, we need all the information we can get, Pete, right? Yes, we do, and we do, and to be real clear, it's not like it doesn't matter. It just doesn't matter in the way that a lot of people suggest that it matters. I've tried to make this video several times this week. The reason there's been a gap in video making, I guess is the way you say it, right? I don't know. It's because every day I have recorded this video at least twice. And I was trying to have fun with it, because the first initial impulse, I think, was really funny. If it had been live or on a podcast, I think we would have got chuckles and moved on. But after it, I was like, nah, I can do that better. Let's do that thing where I do more than one take. And yeah, still, I don't like doing that. So it just kept getting not there. And I think part of it is I'm not trolling here. I have a real time play acting what it sounds like or what it must be to get inside the head of someone who thinks that a Combine or a Pro Day stat significantly matters in the way that they are typically used. In the sense that I'm now hearing about players with all the things that we could possibly want. Now, have to drop them in my ranks now. So, another introduction for this video is, hello, my name's Peter Howard, at Pahowdy on Twitter. I write for DynastyLeagueFootball.com. I am a fake nerd, and I am here to take your lunch money, you Combine nerd. Ready? It's not even, like, I'm trying not to be the antithesis of how incredulent I can get about stuff here, because it's all fun, and if you like Combine, it's fine, it's fine. Try not to go too hard on you here, but it wasn't even hard. It's not even hard. It didn't move either. Nice. Wait. And all those jokes, but like, I don't know how you looked at this at all, ever, and didn't. I don't know how you think. And it's hilarious. Kind of a little hilarious. But yeah, let's take your lunch money. I could use some more lunch. Ready? All right. So, like, usually I'm stressing. Usually it's pretty hard, especially when you're trying to be a statistics nerd when you are in no way qualified to be a statistics nerd. Like, I put out all my data. I make sure I've got everything locked in so that it's kind of bulletproof, in that even if I got something wrong, I showed you exactly what I did, so it was honest and you could find it and see through it if so. But this is... When people talk about the statistical likelihood of players producing using Combine or Pro Day stats, in other words, when they use the word outlier, and that's just a noise coming from your mouth if you're talking about Combine. Like, that's not what that word means. That's not what that word means, like, at all. You shouldn't be using that word. You shouldn't. That's not what it means. I can't say that strong enough. So it's kind of as if I said something like, pull a sentence from the air, whales eat fish sticks on Wednesdays, but only when the equinox is at its zenith in the horizon. You see how all of those are words? but the sentence is just noises coming out of my mouth, because even though some of those words are vaguely scientific or have scientific background to them, if you understand what any of those words actually mean, the sentence is, despite there being verbs and adverbs and adjectives and everything's in place for it to make a meaningful sentence, this player would have to be an outlier because of BMI. That's what that sounds like. And I tried to make it funny, and I tried to just have fun with it, and I did repeatedly, but it never quite made the point for me because I kept getting tired of the character because I don't know how you do that. And so that's the best I've got for you. That's how it sounds when you talk about a player having to be an outlier because of BMI, height, weight, 40 time, or yes, all of the others. Broad jump, vertical, what else do they make them do at the Underwear Olympics? The frickin' three-cone time, yeah, all of them. Now, typically, I just hand-wave it away with, it doesn't have any statistical correlation to anything that happens in the NFL. And it doesn't. It really doesn't. You'd be better off going with the first initial of a player's name. That would probably have better correlation to anything they did in the NFL. Like, seriously, it would probably have better correlation than anything measured at the combine. But here's the thing. Just being honest, correlation isn't everything. There are plenty of things that don't have direct correlation, have direct bearing on an NFL player. How they can play, will they succeed, so on and so forth. And that's true too. And I think that's where combine stats can fit in, but not until you let go of the idea that any particular measurement can make them an outlier, or I guess an inlier, because if you're using the word outlier this way, you think the reverse is an inlier, I'm pretty sure. Because, again, that's not what that word means. It's a word specifically to describe something that happens against what is common, okay? So, like, I had a whole thing worked out with, like, images of players' names, and I was going to do the top 5 list and, like, pretend to be, like, high T BMI guy, and I just can't stay in that space long enough to get through it. So instead, I just did the simple thing. An outlier is something that happens outside of what is common. Okay? Put it in some sort of simple language without the statistical gobbledygook around it. That's what it is. Which means you have to look at what those events, or what those players in this case, have in common in order to say a player is an outlier or not. You can be an outlier to draft capital because there is a strong statistical likelihood that a player that breaks out in the NFL for fantasy is drafted in the first 3 rounds. You can be an outlier to production because most players who produce in the NFL, like the vast majority, have common similar traits in the way they produce in college, outside of Terry McLaurin and Michael Thomas, and players that played quarterback and running back at the college level, or barely played at all, or didn't play wide receiver, essentially. And there's like, and even with all that in tow, you get like 4 or 5 examples. And granted, there are not that many players that hit, even going back to 2000, but that's still really, that's not enough to say, yeah, this player could have been a utility player. He played wide receiver, but he could be like a utility player. He's not a utility player. Stop it. He's not a running back. It doesn't matter that he played quarterback 5 years ago. He's been playing wide receiver the last 4. Yes, there are exceptions, and you can have bad production and be good in the NFL. That's what we talk about most of the time. But the combine is a different kind of animal. So we're just going, like, if we had to explain this to a starter, like someone who just discovered fantasy football was a thing, right? That's how little research it takes to really see why I don't care about the combine that much, or in the way that lots of people seem to suggest we should. And this isn't, by the way, this isn't aimed at anyone in particular. This is a general gripe, a bee in my bonnet. I get that I'm not wearing a hat today, and I think a bonnet is a type of hat, but this is just a general thing, a sense I get from what people in the air say about combine stats. And it's just, like, let's go simple on it. If combine stats had relevance in the way in which it could, or in fact I actively see it being used, then you would expect to see a disproportionate number of players who are good in the NFL for fantasy share those things in common, right? So we don't have to talk about hit rates or percentage of hit rates or likelihood. We don't have to talk about R squared values or probability values or S values or T values or any of that stuff. Just there should be an over-expected number of players in the good group that have a certain trait, right? Not a bell curve. That's how they keep misguidingly telling people to value it, because the bell curve in a hit rate group is based on such a tiny sample compared to players overall that the distribution itself is in question, let alone statistical relevance of outliers or inliers, right? No? Okay, even simpler. If running a 4.5 or less is really important for a player to produce in the NFL, then you wouldn't just expect to see a bell curve in terms of the distribution. You would expect that that bell curve is disproportionately represented in the group they are actually seeking, in the hit group. So it wouldn't be most players run a 4.5 and then most players run a 4.5 in the hit rate group. It would be disproportionately slanted towards a 4.5 40 time, and the rest of the broad group would not be, indicating that that level of 40 time in some way made a player more statistically likely to actually be good in the NFL than the majority of players. I feel like I lost you. Let's break it down. This over here, actually it's over there, but this over here is actually a table full of every player since 2000, every one of them, that had college stats that we can actually use. Even Terry McLaurin, right there at the top of the list, who has a top 24 season in fantasy scoring or more, right? Multiple seasons, top 12, top 5 seasons, all of them, right? All right. So what I did is I went and looked, and that's all it takes, believe it or not, at the averages of players that have fantasy relevance since 2001, I think. And I looked at their BMI, their weight, their height, and their 40 time, okay? So these are the averages in this row right here. So players who have good fantasy production, at least 1 year, right? Cool. Have on average have a 27 BMI. On average, a 204 pounds-ish. Pardon me. Their height is around 73 inches, which is just over 6 foot, just in case the inches thing scares you and makes you confused and run away. And they, on average, run a 4.5. So you can see where those threshold stats were used pretty often. And decision tree analysis, by the way, is an entirely different thing that employs combine statistics, not in terms of outliers or that they're more likely. They employ them in an accurate way. RotoViz uses decision trees for rookies all the time, and somehow lots of people involved in the narrative combine pro day stats don't get how that's not what they mean or how they're useful. So we're going simple. I think this is simple anyway. So those are the averages. Now the thresholds I typically hear about for all four are slightly different. And the reason is because most people pushing this propaganda, I mean most people who are misguided enough to think it has some relevance in an area that it does not, tend to want to take credit for Stephon Diggs. Essentially, most recently, that's the player, right? But there are also some others. And actually, I've been playing Dynasty Football for a while, and it used to be 27 or more. And now, when the propaganda, I mean the lie, I mean the misguided notion that BMI has a statistical relevance to success in the NFL, or ceiling of success in the NFL, I hear it pushed down to 26. Maybe that's just a coincidence. I don't think so. But 26 is actually the one I hear bandied about most often. And so 26 is the one we're going to go with. The weight, I hear, 190 pounds a lot. But we're just going to go ahead and cut the top off the number here and say 200 pounds. We can go 190 and see how that changes things. It does not at all. That's the whole point. But we can do 190. But for now, we'll just start at 200 just because I think we generally think of alpha wide receivers as being thick and 200 pounds and over 6 foot tall, and that's essentially what I've got inserted here in the weight, the height, and the BMI. Sorry, ghost, don't know. 40 40 time under a 4.5, right? That's the threshold that's always been constantly bandied about, and in fact, it's exactly on the average. If you break it down, it's actually a 4.48 or so. But yeah, 4.5. That's the one everyone's comfortable with. You don't you don't want a 4.6 player, apart from all those ones that you do want. Okay, so the outliers. Hang on, for some reason, I feel like anyone who's missed this might, misconstrue outliers without my sarcasm. So I'm gonna put the little bunny rabbit ears around it. Outliers, right? So the outliers in the hit group, all those players who've had fantasy relevant production, who are under or above, depending which is relevant, those thresholds are listed right here. 16 of those 85 players have a BMI below 26. 16, that's a tiny piddly number. Look at that big, robust 85. Yeah, I'm with you. Just please hang in there just a tiny bit sooner, because the next bit, and it's just as simple, is I think the part you're missing. I think. Okay, so 34 players are under that 200 weight that we mentioned, so the big, thick guys, and 21 of those players are under 6 foot tall, so under 72 inches. I'm pretty sure 72 inches breaks down to 6 foot. There'll be someone to owe me in the comments if not. 32 players out of those 85 had had greater than a 4.5, but that's okay, because if someone runs a 4.8, as constantly happens, by the way, will just be rounded down if they hit. He ran a 4.5. Well, it was a 4.58. Yeah, that's a 4.5. But before the draft, a 4.58 is concerning. That's an interesting switch up, because I don't know if you've noticed, but most fantasy analysts have 0 checks on them. We can pretty much make it up, especially after the fact. And you can also, and that's what the attempts I was trying to make, show how you could rewrite the narrative based on these 4 stats to prove that those who had bad stats or bad combine stats, they're not really even statistics, physical measurements, you can rewrite it by just looking at the 1 or 2 that they cross the thresholds of and saying, you need a combination of these 2, or a combination of these 2, or a combination of these 2. But if you look at enough of the outliers to combine stats, what you eventually figure out is you can have any combination, including none of them, and still make a decent narrative to why they matter. And there's literally no accountability to people that say a 4.5 is a 4.5 after they hit, and a 4.58 is a 4.58 before they hit. Yeah, we get owned on Twitter, but honestly, we just enjoy the interaction. So, I know, maybe not owning or calling people out, because it does nothing. And honestly, most of us involved in this just freaking enjoy a good argument. But for your own process, I want to start taking note of that. What were we saying before the draft, and what were we saying after the draft for 40 times that are above 4.5 but still below 4.6? Might be something worth noting. Alright, so what do we have here? We see that a relatively low number of players hit with a BMI below 26. Neat. Scott Barrett did this in one tweet, by the way. I'm taking a whole, 50-minute video. I don't know what this is going to end up being. Scott Barrett's better than me. I think everyone knows that. So, I live with that. But he pointed out that only one player drafted in the first round has a BMI in, I think, Devontae Smith's range right now. And the whole sarcasm in that tweet is, you're using one player to say any other player can't happen. You don't understand this. That's fine, but you don't. And I'm pointing out that 16 out of 85 is 18%. Sure, but that's the second step. Stay with me. All right, 40% of players below a 200 weight actually are in the hit rate group. So a lot of players, to be fair, a decent number of players. And that's why we like BMI, the thickness, not just the weight, right? Until after it happens, and then you can pick and choose which of the 4 mattered in hindsight, without ever pointing out that you can't say which of the 4 matter in foresight, because actually it's just a narrative you're applying to numbers and making it sound like statistical analysis. So, height, same thing, around 24% of players in the hit group, just any kind of hit, top 24 season, have a height below 6 foot, 40 time, 37% of the players have above a 4.5 in the 40 time. So already you can start to see if you just look at it blankly. But what about ceiling? We can also get there, just bear with me, because this is a bit that I think, hopefully, some missed. So, those are the percentages, and that's fine, but we're dealing with an 85 sample here, like 85 players of any kind of fantasy relevant season since 2001, and it's a really, I think you can see how that's a really small number, especially when 243 players have been just drafted in the first 3 rounds at the wide receiver position in that time frame, and that's this number down here, and that's a but. That's a but. But am I Canadian now? I don't know. So this is the second part of it. If any of these numbers had some kind of guide or signal or substance to them in terms of whether a player is more or less statistically likely to be good in the NFL, or their ceiling, then you would expect to see a disproportionate amount of them being in the hit rate group. Now, why am I saying that? Because if the same proportion from all players that are drafted in the first 3 rounds is also reflected in the hit rate group, then essentially what you're seeing is it's a null equation. It means the same percentage, so they represent about the same proportion in the group you're actually seeking, which probably means that the thing you're using to separate them out has no bearing on if they succeed. It's just in proportion to the rate at which they're drafted, right? And that's the case. There's no disproportionate amount of players that hit above those thresholds that are drafted at those or below or above those thresholds. It's pretty much the same bell curve from all players to the good players they're actually seeking. It's proportional. Players that break out or have good fantasy seasons with a BMI below 26 do so at a proportional rate to which they are drafted. Sounds like a fancy sentence, but I'm hoping you see that that's just common sense, man. And wait, same thing, about 40% of players, all players that are drafted, like all of them, all the ones you didn't want and didn't like and spent all that time profiling were like, nah, bruh. All of them but together, the 243 players, and that's just in the first 3 rounds. This is just using the most likely to break out with draft capital, which is our best single guide. 40% breakout, and then 40% of the breakout players in the hits sample are also below 200 pounds. So it's the same. The bell curve is identical. Height, there is a slight disproportion there. 30% of players that are drafted are over 6 foot, and only 24% of players that are drafted are at that hit in the first 3 rounds actually have a height over 6 foot tall, or under 6 foot tall, sorry. And so maybe height has some bearing? Wait, we'll get there, because part of this is the whole NFL is a sample size trap, by the way. Which means why we shouldn't use something that has no signal and only use things that do, because already it's not enough. Like, we get laughed out of actual statistics boards when we try to ask them to help with our statistics. That's how bad the NFL stats are. Alright, 40 times, same thing. 29% of players drafted had a 4.5 40 time or over. 37% of players drafted that hit have a 4.5 40 time or over. So it's proportional to the rate at which they are drafted into the NFL. Now, what I think you might be missing, because there are some, like, outside of weight, these numbers aren't exactly the same, but by the time we get here, we're dealing with 85 players. 243 is pretty tiny for a statistical sample, but it's okay. You know, triple digits at least. So what I went and did is translated it into what I hope is more recognizable numbers. So if BMI had statistical relevance for if you are likely to hit in the NFL at any level for fantasy, then you would expect about 18.5 players for there to be disproportionately more than 18.5 players hitting with a BMI at or over 26. And we don't see that. It's literally 2 players. So if 2 players hit in the next 3 years with a BMI 26 or below, we're statistically identical to all players drafted. If a player is If weight had a thing to say about whether a player is more or less likely to hit in the NFL, then you would expect a disproportionately higher number than 34 players to hit in that hit rate group using the percentage of all players drafted. And so this number is essentially the hit rate group times the drafted group, okay? So the bell curve, if you like, of those that are actually drafted. So you would expect 34 players to hit if weight had no bearing on whether they were likely to be successful, because in other words, they're proportionally related. And because those percentages are identical, the actual number of players that hit are identical. 34 players to 34 players. And what I'm hoping you're noticing here is that when you get down to an 85 sample size and start talking about 18%, that sounds like a really small number, but it's actually 2 players different from what you would consider a proportional representation. Okay? How about height? You should see 25 players hit in the NFL based on the number that are drafted, and we see 21. So there are 4 players. Four players difference in 20 years. That's not relevant. 40 time, you would expect to see 25 players represented in the hit rate group based on the proportion of players actually drafted into the NFL in the first 3 rounds, and what we see is 32. So we actually see a higher percentage of players and a higher number of players hitting with a bad 40 time, just using a 4.5. And again, we could adjust to 4.8 being good if we have to post hoc after it happens. But anything close to a 4.6 is pretty much considered a negative factor in rookie evaluation. And more players hit with above 4.5 than we would expect based on the proportion of those drafted. So does that mean running a 4.5 and getting top 3 round draft capital actually makes you more likely to hit? No, because it's like a 7 player difference. And notice that's a bigger player difference, and it's a one where the counterintuitive interpretation actually bears out in the stats. I'm way too deep into this deal with you right now. Yes, you're a cat. I get it. Sorry. So, essentially what I'm telling you is the representation in the hit group is identical to the representation in those drafted. There is no disproportional nature to BMI, height, weight, or 40 time, or height adjusted speed score, or weight adjusted speed score, or 3-cone time, or arm length, or rate at which players can jump over a hobby horse while carrying a spoon, or whatever they make them do over there at the high school Olympics. That's what it looks like to me. It's not, however, that these things don't matter. I mean, there are literal medical studies right now to try and help us understand the impact of health on bodies at certain shapes, sizes, at different positions. And counterintuitively, being smaller than the running back position and being at the running back position might actually lead to less severe hits because you can intend for contact and adjust for it and protect yourself a little bit better than at the wide receiver position. And that's from a layman who's definitely not a statistician and is no way a doctor, but that's just the research I've read. So all of this bears relevance to how they will survive in the NFL, but I don't think anyone who missed that there's no disproportional relationship to those drafted to those hitting has read any of that better than I have anyway. And again, I've come across nothing to suggest that that means we should lean on BMI. BMI, by the way, junk science created in like the 18th century that now, at least as to my understanding, most doctors feel should not be used in health evaluations, and actually did public harm by inserting it into the public health conversation because it misrepresented people's actual health at their weights and heights, and actually might have done some significant damage to the populace, or at least the populace's understanding of its health. So, like, it's not even science or pretend science at this point, and yet it's not a thing. It's not. But the other thing I hear a lot of is ceiling, right? So let's do the same thing with those with top 12 seasons and only top 12 seasons. How about that? Okay, yeah, I had to get Penny out the room, so there was a brief pause there. But what were we doing? Oh yeah, this is so easy. Ceiling. Oh no, he's only 190 pounds, he has a BMI below 26, whatever, and therefore maybe the ultimate range of his outcomes is now out the question. I understand how that's an attempt to modify rankings based on information that is definitely important and tells us a lot about a player and how a player might have to play or how a player was playing in college. It tells us a lot of stuff. It's incredibly descriptive, and description is incredibly important. And again, decision tree analysis consistently bears out that it's relevant, just not in the way that you're using it. Strawman guy who loves combine stats. I'm not thinking of no one in particular, because I'm really not. Alright, so ceiling players, right? The average for players with top 12 seasons, again, it's the same table, but I highlight it in a separate color, so you know it's a separate thing, right? Fairly similar, right? Weirdly, right? So the ceiling production of players is represented by a BMI of 27, again, I just use the 26 threshold, a weight of 205, again, I just use the 200 threshold, a height of 72, again, 73, actually. They get slightly taller, to be fair. I just used 72, but there you go, a live update, so I really have no, I know this to be true. And a 40 time of slightly faster. Remember, the actual average for the top 24 guys was 4.48. In this one, I've got it broken down to 2 decimal places, so you can see it's 1/100th of a second faster. Yay! For the average of players with ceilings, which is the same group, to be honest. Alright, do we see a disproportionately represented group in the hits compared to all drafted? No, we don't. Now, it is slightly different in that they're slightly more exaggerated, which is why I understand that what might appear to be a decent modification based on combine results, while being aware that combine results don't really have that effect. I understand it because the hits get much smaller, and so it's a much smaller target to hit, and it's okay to downplay modification for poorer descriptions, because honestly we're really venturing into narrative street when we've got a sample of 56 players who've actually had top 12 seasons from the first 3 rounds since 2001. I get it, and I'm not saying you should stop doing that or calling anyone out for doing that. I just think I definitely misunderstood this when I started playing Dynasty and Redraft, to be honest with you, and I think some other people might not understand it as well as those people making those reasonable adjustments. That's probably the fairest way to say it. So, 21% of players are represented in all those drafted, of those 243. Again, it's the same numbers, so 53 are outliers in that 243 group. The proportion in the hit rate is around 14%. The proportion of players represented being under 200 pounds is around 35%, so you see weight once again has the least amount of significance, and all of these have no significance. Height, around the same proportional difference as we saw with the 24 rank group, but you can also see it gets slightly tighter even at height. And again, 40 time, the inverse interpretation, the counterintuitive interpretation would you would have to make in order to believe these stats had any real value in terms of likelihood of producing. In that 35% of players are represented in the top 12 sample having a 4.5 or greater, so a slower 40 time, whereas 29% of players drafted have a greater than 4.5 time. So in other words, more players are hitting. An above average percentage of players are represented in the hit rate group compared to the null or the Bell distribution average of all players drafted. And so inversely, that if you thought 40 time mattered to likelihood of success or likelihood of ceiling success, you would probably have to conclude that a slower 40 time makes you more likely to produce a top 12 season. And that's just silly. I think we can all see that's just silly, right? That's okay. It's just as silly going one way as the other way, like having a max BMI makes you more likely. Nah. Having a min BMI makes you less likely. Nah, it doesn't. Yeah, it tells you something, and it might tell you something about how you want to adjust down, because they're the least Calvin Johnson-like. I want the most Calvin Johnson-like player, don't get me wrong. But it doesn't make them more or less likely to reach it. It just doesn't. They're not disproportionately represented in the different samples. In fact, the inverse is true with 40 time. And again, to maybe make this sound a little less fake nerdy and put it in real terms, you would expect 12 players in those 56 of those 56 hits with top 12 seasons to have above average BMI. In fact, only 8 players have below average BMI in the sample, which again suggests that BMI hasn't led us wrong too often. But where that's a difference of 4 players, can you see how I'm just going, I don't care. It's 4 players over 20 years. If we get another 4 players over the next 3, then it's statistically identical. So has no significance, which based on the history of this stuff happens pretty often because it basically has no significance to the likelihood of producing in the NFL. It just doesn't. That's what words mean. Sorry, where was I? Anyway, 22 players should be represented in the hit rate group based on the overall distribution of players having under 200 pounds, and in fact 20 are different. So you've got a 2-player difference. It's slight, but it's way too slight to say it's more or less likely to actually hit in the NFL. How about height? 17 players should be represented, only 14 players are represented. It's a 3-player difference, and you can start to see how little 25% of 56 really means. We're talking about a really tiny sample. 29% of players are represented in the all drafted in the first 3 rounds, so you would expect 16 players to actually hit if there is no significance to 40 time. And in fact, 20 players hit, again, kind of leading to the inverse conclusion, which makes as little sense as saying a player with a low 40 time is more likely to hit. The thresholds are useful, they're really interested and they're really descriptive. I find a ton of value in knowing them, but they do not make a player more or less likely to produce in the NFL. And they do not, and I can find no even basic reasoning to suggest that having a good above or below threshold marker on your profile makes you more likely to hit your ceiling in terms of fantasy, in terms of the floor in terms of fantasy. Even that modifier, although I admit, all this is fair because we should adjust based on how we should adjust on our fees for rookies. I'm a big fan of that. But you can't say the statistically more likely or less likely because that's not what words mean. Or you can, because it's a freaking free world and you can say whatever you want, but you also get a nerd like tilting on YouTube at you. So I guess that's the consequence. That's the that's the comeuppance of saying things that make no sense if you know what the words mean. Now, I know I can hear what you're saying. If these groups are all so small, and this is probably not what you're saying, then why does anything matter? Pete, small sample size traps, everything is, yeah. You know what every player has? It's not a certain BMI over or under a threshold, by the way. It's age. Every player has ages and plays at certain ages, and we can compare them to players that played at those ages in different conferences. Now, we can also do that with a lot of other things, like BMI, weight, height, anything that every player has, and we can track. And age is the one that consistently proves to be useful. Now, there are some interesting ideas that, you can adjust that by the season they break out based on when they started playing. And that's a really interesting idea. I started to play with a little bit more, but I still don't know. You're still adding modifiers, which reduces sample size, and then you end up with no disproportional representation overall. But let me show you why it's still relevant. How about that? It's fair to, you can go do the same thing with age adjustments or breakout ages to see that some things are relevant and disproportionately represented in the sample, and this isn't just some statistical trickery. All my data literally not pinned, because it's YouTube. Literally, the link is down below. It's free. You click on it again, you get to the spreadsheet, and you can see that I'm not lying or trickerying with numbers here to show a lack of disproportional representation. Why don't I do it for you? I'm here, you're here, we're already 40 minutes in. Why the hell not? Boom. Yeah, I already did it. I was lying. Breakout age at the 20% threshold and the 30% threshold. As you can see, the average, so the bell curve in the distribution for just all players drafted, is around 19. Most common breakout age is 19. So that's a similar problem with the 4-5, right? Most players run around a 4-5. And most players break out around 19. Very true. 30% threshold, most players break out around 20, and that's the proportional representation in all players drafted, all right? But, oh my god, look at this. There is a drastically disproportionate number of players represented, even just using breakout age, which in my other videos and content I've said is a good indicator, but not in itself the best use of that signal, because we can actually break into their individual seasons and sum it up in various different ways. Lots of nerds have different ways they prefer. I prefer to look at the actual years, compare them on a graph, and just see kind of what breaks down. As I've been doing in my rookie profiles, and lots of dynasty players love to make formulas and models with age included in those adjustments. Or Anthony Amico uses years out of high school, which is a similar process and one I regularly argue with him about. But it's trying to use what is a signal that is disproportionately represented in the sample of hits compared to all players drafted. Now I can hear what you're saying. Peep. You're probably not saying it that way because you sound handsome and intelligent and I sound like this. But 57 and 49 don't sound drastically different. Okay, I got you. We're looking at 4 and 7 player samples and kind of hand waving them away. Just 3 or 4 more players. So what are the numbers here? You would expect 42 players in the breakout age of 20% to be represented in the outlier group, in the hit rate group. And in fact, 49% of players. And now it is fair to say 42 and 49 are very, very similar numbers. That's 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 7 players different, which again is a larger number of disproportional representation than any combine stat significantly, in my opinion. But that's also what, and this is actually a great way of showing why RotoViz pushed out the work they did. I think it was last off-season, the off-season before, advocating for, which has now pretty much become the standard, of thinking of a 30% threshold. This is actually a great representation of what they found, even though they went about it a very smarter, nerdier kind of way to prove it, and went to a lot more work. This was really easy. I can't tell you how easy it is to see proportional representation in hits versus not hits. You should know it if you've looked at combine stats and tried to use them. I don't know any other way of saying it to you. But if we look at that 30% threshold, we should see 23 players represented based on the average number of players with draft ages in all drafted players, all players in the first 3 rounds, right? But instead what we see is 53. That's 30 extra players hitting if they have a breakout age under 20. That's more than 4. That's a lot more than 7 in this same group of 85 players. Remember looking over here? How we were like, yeah, it's 1 player different. It's actually more players. It's actually the exact same number of players. 30 extra players hit just based on the very simple and not ideal, but a good indicator profile of a 30% breakout age. And the reason I still use 20 and the reason I don't like 30 is because breakout age itself isn't the best way of using age. And so I still like to keep, just as a simple identifier, players that break out at 20%, so I can spot T. Higgins, for example, or Doug Baldwin, for another example, and then go dig into their profile, or if you're much nerdier than me, make a model that actually tells you what they actually did compared to the average on a year-by-year basis, based on the years they played, when they broke out, and all that stuff, and that I do in my rookie profile videos. So I still think 20% has significance, but if you're not me, and it is fair to say that a 7-player difference is more. But if we're hand waving 4-player differences, we can hand wave 7-player differences. You can't hand wave a 30-player extra disproportional representation in the hit group. That's just more. by like a significant percentage. 62% of players in the hit group have a below 20 breakout age at a 30% threshold. Only 27% of those drafted do. That's what disproportional representation looks like. And again, that's just a basic way you start to think about outliers. Who is disproportionately represented? Then you go dig into the stats. Instead, a lot of combine evaluation seems to have started at the end by looking at the numbers and the average and just saying, outlier! That guy's an outlier. That guy would have to be an outlier. That's not what that word means. And you can use it, you can have it. I'm making a new one. Flibbles. Flibbles. There we go, statistics nerds. That's what outliers used to be. And you have to be a flibble to succeed in the NFL with below age-adjusted production, and you can be whatever frick you want to call them to be a combine outlier, I guess, because this isn't it, fam. So again, in sum, and I guess we should go big screen to do the summary. Yeah, that seems fair. Oh wow, the little video didn't even play this time. I guess it's tired too. So in sum, combine stats are worth paying attention to. Travis May at RotoViz is doing some really hard work. Non-paid promotion, by the way, because I hate that guy, you know what I mean? So I want to let you know about him. Collecting all those combine stats and pumping them out for us. And Matt Spencer, also at RotoViz, has just produced an article suggesting that over the years, combine times and pro day times have become so similar, like the difference between them has dropped significantly over time if you use an appropriate sample and discard outliers. As the word discard flibbles, as is my new word. Very Phoebe Buffet of me, but still. That they're almost identical. So this year might be slightly different because it's a slightly different year for everything. But Matt's work seems to suggest that pro day times can be used this year as you would normally do. Pro day times can be used as you would normally use combine times. And frankly, you kind of have to anyway. Make an adjustment if you want, but you're going to make the same adjustment to everyone because everyone's doing a pro day, not a combine, and so it's a null proposition, right? It's the same thing. You're just going to adjust everyone up 0.5, so it's the same freaking thing, unless you want to compare it to past players. In which case, I would advise, not using any 2020 stuff if you're going to compare them to past players. But so it's actually a really good time to use pro day times, according to Matt. Travis May is pushing them out. I want to know them. I know how fast these players are running. I know how big and small they are. No matter how much I meme over it on Twitter, I am aware. Because it tells me a lot about the player. It describes them. It describes how they might have to play, how they were playing in college. It tells us a lot of stuff. It makes a better, more even way to compare them to past players, or how they may have to play based on past players. If you're tiny, you kind of have to be Philip Lindsay. So what did Philip Lindsay do? What does Philip Lindsay look like when we watch him versus this guy? Does he have potential commonality there? There's lots to be gained. And again, decision tree analysis uses combine numbers very effectively, kind of as the last ditch, and that's where 40 time and weight starts to come in. At the very last split on those decision trees is often, well, we have to make a decision, so we may as well lean towards what we think is more positive based on obvious. Well, actually, it's based on different statistical analysis and again, that I think last time I saw a decision tree, it was over there at RotoViz. And so if you're more a decision tree player guy, he has to be this, then he has to be this, then he has to be this. However you go about it, that's fine. But if you're looking at a combine time and thinking, oh man, now he doesn't have the same ceiling, how are you defining ceiling before? Because that was probably the way to do it. Either that's wrong, or you're being overly swayed by combine or pro day numbers. If you're looking at a pro day performance and thinking, well, he can never hit now, then whatever led you to think he could be a hit is probably where you have your uncertainty. Because there are things that can tell us they are more or less likely, even though we're barely beating a coin flip, but we are beating a coin flip, especially at the wide receiver position. So the problems come earlier, and outlier terms and likelihood and non-likelihood based on pro day numbers are starting at the end with, as far as I can tell, any real understanding of what's meant to come before it. And yeah, combine times are really useful. Pro day times, sorry. You should know them. I'm not discouraging you from being excited or underexcited about them. But when it comes to rubber meeting road, in terms of I love this player, but he has bad pro day numbers, I would say that's the least concerning thing you could say. In other words, if it's a decision between two players, and one you love but has bad pro day times or measurements, and one you are okay on and has good combine pro day numbers, just go with the guy you like. That would be my advice. Or to put it another way, as simple as I can say it, if a player has everything in common that players actually have in common, to being successful in the NFL, if they're overproductive, have a different breakout age, the tape measures up. Not my tape evaluation, but I listen and learn from other tape evaluators, and they're seeing the kind of things that they expect to see from a good wide receiver, the type of routes or whatever it is they freaking look at, the positive reviews from the tape. If everything else lines up, but their pro day goes badly, I couldn't give a